Good morning, everybody. My name is Daryl Kimball. I'm Executive Director of the Arms Control Association, independent, non-governmental. I'm your moderator for today's session on whether Presidents Trump and Putin can agree on nuclear limits after New START expires. And the 2010 New Strategic Arms Control Treaty, which has already been extended once, cannot be extended again, and it will expire on February 5, 2026, which is only 296 days from now. The treaty, which is the last remaining agreement limiting the arsenals of the two largest weapons possessor states, holds each side to no more than 1,550 treaty-accountable deployed strategic nuclear warheads on no more than 700 strategic missiles and bombers. Without some form of new reciprocal constraints, Russia and the United States could conceivably increase the number of deployed strategic nuclear weapons for the first time since the end of the Cold War more than 35 years ago. The United States and Russia, which are both in the process of multi-billion-dollar, multi-year programs to modernize and upgrade their already massive nuclear arsenals, have not engaged in meaningful nuclear arms reduction talks in many years. Following Russia's 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Kremlin suspended implementation of New START and rejected overtures from the White House for follow-on talks on a new nuclear arms control framework, citing the United States' hostile policy towards Russia. Since taking office a second time, however, President Trump has expressed support for nuclear talks with Russia and with China in terms not uttered by a Republican politician in recent memory. In response to a question about U.S.-China relations back in January, he said, and I quote, "Tremendous amounts of money are being spent on nuclear, and the destructive capability is something that we don't even want to talk about. So we want to see if we can denuclearize, and I think that's very possible," unquote. He repeated similar comments two more times later this year. And the Kremlin has replied that it wants to resume the nuclear dialogue, quote, "as soon as possible." But at the moment, in mid-April, with just 296 days to go before New START does expire, there are no active talks between Moscow and Washington on a follow-on to the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. Meanwhile, China, which is rapidly expanding its smaller but still deadly strategic nuclear force, continues to resist bilateral talks with Washington on nuclear risk reduction and arms control. None of the 5 nuclear armed states parties to the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty can claim they are meeting their NPT Article 6 obligation to, quote, "pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to the cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament." From the perspective of the Arms Control Association and many others, halting the cycle of spiraling nuclear tensions is in every nation's interest and is every nation's obligation. The success of the global nuclear nonproliferation disarmament system has always relied, to some extent or another, on effective cooperation and dialogue between the United States and Russia. And it will, in the future, depend on the engagement and support from China, as well as France and from the UK. The looming expiration of New START and the need for progress on nuclear disarmament will likely be a key theme at this month's third and final preparatory committee meeting for the 2026 Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty Review Conference. And so with us today for this Arms Control Association briefing are 3 leading experts on nuclear weapons and arms control policy to explore what nuclear arms control issues might eventually be discussed between Presidents Trump and Putin and their advisors, when, who might be involved in these talks, and what pathways might be most feasible for U.S. and Russian negotiators, as well as what the potential consequences are if the two sides fail to achieve new nuclear constraints on their arsenals. If I could ask our panelists to turn on their cameras. We're going to be starting with my friend and colleague, Tom Countryman, who served for 35 years at the United States State Department in various capacities, including as Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Nonproliferation, and as Acting Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security before retiring in 2017. He now serves as the chair of the Arms Control Association Board of Directors. After Tom speaks, we'll hear from one of Russia's most respected and knowledgeable experts on nuclear weapons and arms control, Alexey Arbatov, who is the head of the Center for International Security at the Primakov National Research Institute of World Economy and International Relations. Alexey is joining us from Moscow today. Добрый день. He'll be followed by María Antonieta Jáquez, coordinator for disarmament and nuclear nonproliferation at the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She's a veteran diplomat and specialist in nuclear nonproliferation and disarmament. Tonie is joining us from Mexico City, and thank you for getting up early this morning, Tonie. Following their opening remarks, I'm going to be asking each of them a couple of opening questions before we turn to you, our audience. You can put your questions as we go along through the Q&A function in the Zoom menu that you'll see below. Our session is on the record and will be archived on the Arms Control Association website in the coming days. And so with that introduction, let me ask Tom to start us out. Tom, welcome, and thanks for starting us off. The floor is yours, and if others could turn off their cameras for the moment until we get to the Q&A, or until you're speaking, that would be great. Thanks. Tom.
Okay, thank you, Daryl. It's an honor to be here, especially with colleagues I admire so much, Tonie, Jáquez, and Alexey Arbatov. It is also very topical. There is an urgency to discussion of U.S.-Russian limits on nuclear arms. As you noted, Daryl, less than 300 days until the last significant treaty between the two expire. It's not quite the most urgent question in the nuclear field. There is an even nearer deadline for the US, Iran, and other powers to reach some sort of agreement about Iran's nuclear enrichment program. And I'm glad there have been some encouraging signs there. But with the New START treaty expiring in February, followed closely next spring by the Nonproliferation Treaty Review Conference, there is a need for Washington and Moscow not just to think and talk about, but to actually reach some practical arrangements. There is a real incentive, as you pointed out, for President Trump to find some form of arms control agreement with the Russian Federation. Mr. Trump has been interested in the field for more than 40 years. He has a hankering for a Nobel Peace Prize that perhaps a nuclear agreement could deliver. And he has an important incentive, as he has said, to reduce the incredible amount of money, $80 billion a year plus, that the US spends on its nuclear weapons program. The possibilities should be welcomed equally on the Russian side, although sometimes I feel that there is hesitation or a different set of priorities coming from Moscow, with Mr. Putin primarily focused upon achieving what he will be able to describe as a victory in Ukraine. I think nuclear weapons take second place to the current Russian priorities. Now, it is not too difficult to envisage a very simple agreement between the two presidents. There is not enough time to negotiate a new treaty that could maintain or even lower the limits of strategic deployed weapons on both sides. But there is enough time to make an agreement that key parts of the New START treaty would continue to be respected by both sides. And we have a precedent for this as well. In 1979, when President Carter and Chairman Brezhnev reached an agreement on the SALT II treaty, it was never ratified by the US Senate. It was harshly criticized by Ronald Reagan in his 1980 campaign. But upon taking office, Reagan reached an agreement with Moscow that both sides would continue to respect the main substantive requirements of the treaty, even though the treaty was not ratified and not legally in force. So we have a precedent for what could be a very simple agreement between the two sides. And it's important that it be a simple agreement because, as I said, not enough time to negotiate anything like the several hundred pages that the New START treaty required. But it could be an agreement that would be simple to explain, not only to President Trump, but to the public in both the US and Russia, and that would be welcomed by the rest of the world. In the ideal form, an agreement between the two could be as short as one sentence. And that sentence could say that the Russian Federation and the United States agree to limit their nuclear arsenal deployment to the levels specified in the New START treaty. That would be all it would take. There are other sentences I would like to see. Certainly a second sentence that said the two sides agree that they will intensify their consultations with a view to negotiating a new treaty at lower arsenal levels. A third sentence that would be very valuable would be that the two sides agree to resume their notifications to each other of movements of nuclear weapons. This is a key transparency measure under the New START agreement. I think it would be unlikely that the two sides could agree for the other important verification measure, which is on-site inspection of nuclear facilities by each country. But whether it was one or two or three sentences, each of the key provisions would be not only helpful to the national security of both countries, but would also be welcomed by the rest of the world, and I think welcomed by the public in the two countries. It would set a better tone for the very important Nonproliferation Treaty Review Conference that will be held next year. And think about the absence of such an agreement. If New START expires next February without any new measures in place, there could quickly be a race between Moscow and Washington to upload additional warheads onto missiles and submarines and bombers in both countries. That would be a race that nobody could win. What I'm talking about, of course, is not a treaty, but simply a political agreement, a little bit more than a handshake, but much less than a treaty. Still, the United States and the Soviet Union, later Russian Federation, have addressed a number of their key concerns through such political agreements. It has to be recalled that arms control is a process not just of treaties, but of arrangements and agreements that the two sides take to reduce the threat they pose to each other, reduce the risk to their national security that they face. Without an agreement, not only will both sides struggle to meet the additional economic cost of a new arms race, they will inevitably as well have to make some sacrifices on their conventional military. For Russia, which it would mean detracting from the military force that it has used in its war in Ukraine. For the United States, it would mean detracting from what US military advisors say is necessary in order to meet potential Chinese security challenges in Asia. So there's a strong incentive for both sides. And in particular, I know Tonie will speak to this as well, it would be I think, a very negative sign to the rest of the world if these two countries don't meet their obligation under Article 6 in this very minimal way. So we have a situation where both sides can benefit from a simple, straightforward political agreement that preserves the most important aspect of New START, the limits on deployed warheads. I hope that there is not an effort to tie this to any other issue. I am concerned that with the Russian priority given to the situation in Ukraine, that it will be harder to move forward on this until there is a greater clarity about the resolution of the conflict in Ukraine. I'll stop there, and I look forward to hearing from my friends and taking questions from this big audience.
All right, thank you very much, Tom. That's a great way to start. Let me ask Alexey to join us now on camera. As I mentioned before, Alexey Arbatov is the head of the Center for International Security at the Primakov National Research Institute of World Economy and International Relations, and has been an observer and advisor on these issues for many years. Alexey, it's great to have you. The floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you, Daryl. It's a great honor and pleasure to be with you, and I look forward to questions and answers and discussion, which will follow the prepared statements. I agree with what Tom said, that there is very little time left to negotiate a new treaty. Neither political situation is conducive to that, and certainly from technical point of view, according to a deep split between positions of the two sides on the follow-on treaty, the time is very short. Of course, politically binding agreement of the kind that was mentioned by Tom would be a simple way to go forward. But just for discussion, I can suggest to you that there is also a technical way to extend the New START treaty. As it was pointed out correctly by Tom, Article 14 of the New START implies that the treaty may be extended only once for 5 years, and that was done in 2021. However, Article 15 says that it's possible to introduce amendments to the treaty, and the amendment could change this provision of being able to extend only once for 5 years. And I will quote to you the wording of the previous treaty, which is START 1, in which I was very lucky to participate in its negotiations. And this is Article 17 of the START 1 treaty that was signed in 1991. And the Article 17 says, the treaty shall be extended for successive 5-year periods if the parties so decide, in accordance with the procedures governing the initial extension, and it shall remain in force for each agreed 5-year period of extension unless it is superseded by a subsequent agreement on the reduction, and so on. So there is not, it's not a holy scripture, this treaty, and this Article 14 of the treaty can be changed by amendment. But the political factors make it difficult, because such amendment would require new ratification. In the United States Senate, probably there will be a stronger position to ratification of such amendment. All will depend on whether President Trump would be in favor of that. And this is another political question which requires the answer. But this relates not only to amending the treaty, it relates to the treaty as a whole. The treaty was negotiated by Obama administration. It was extended by 5 years by President Biden administration. So my question is, will President Trump be willing to extend this treaty either by politically binding agreement or by formally amending it according to provision of Article 15, which provides for amending the treaty on agreement of both sides. Now, with respect to Russian position, it was correctly mentioned by Tom that Russia at present is not disposed either to negotiating a new treaty or even to discussing extension of the existing treaty in any way because of the problem of Ukraine. And in Russia, Russian government considers American continuing support of Ukraine with providing weapons and equipment and providing intelligence information not to be conducive to revival of the dialogue on strategic matters. So on both sides, political obstacles to extension of the treaty in one or the other way are the most difficult issue. With respect to Russian position, I'm not sure that Russia at present or in the nearest future would be in favor of further reduction of strategic nuclear weapons. At the preliminary consultations in 2021, Russian position was not in favor of further reductions. It was in favor of expanding the scope of the treaty to include in the next treaty limitations not only on nuclear strategic weapons, but also on strategic conventional weapons, both offensive and defensive, which in particular those which can pose a counterforce threat to deterrent forces of the other side. This is a very general proposition, but certainly it's viable from technical point of view, but would require very complex negotiations, just like American proposal of 2021 that the next treaty should include not only strategic but tactical nuclear weapons as well. It's also a very complex issue. Now, that would be the task for further negotiations if we are able to revive them. I was given a number of particular questions by Daryl Kimball, and I will try to briefly respond to them. One question is about the possibility of uploading Russian strategic forces if United States start uploading strategic forces, that is, taking reserve warheads from storages and putting them back on missiles and on bombers. Russia certainly would respond likewise if United States start doing that after the expiration of the treaty in February next year. The possibility of American uploading is bigger than Russian. Russian is about 500 weapons, and American, according to calculations, is about 1,300 weapons. But nonetheless, it's a huge number which can be added to strategic forces. And Russia is continuing to introduce new missiles and new submarines into its strategic force. The United States is not doing that right now. It has not yet started really to modernize the three legs of its strategic triad. So Russia has a certain advantage in continuing to deploy new weapons without removing older ones, as it was done under the ceilings of the New START Treaty. Now, the question was whether there is any sense in continuing the P5 negotiations which were conducted of the P5 nuclear weapon states of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, starting with 2008. There was a number of sessions. The goal was to involve all 5 nuclear weapon states into nuclear arms limitations. It was a failure. Nothing happened during all those sessions of negotiations which were conducted within the framework of P5. The only thing that was done was to adopt very general resolutions on approving Non-Proliferation Treaty, approving the sustainability of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and other important initiatives, but no limitations were ever seriously discussed within P5. I came to the conclusion a year ago that this is a fruitless, senseless forum. But now I have changed my mind, because now the main problem is not to go forward with strategic arms reductions or nuclear arms reductions. The principal task now is to save and sustain what we already have, because both CTBT is under threat and Non-Proliferation Treaty so is in danger, and even the preservation of certain politically binding agreements on the New START is also not guaranteed. So sustaining what we have now is the #1 priority for the nearest future. And in this sense, the practice of the P5 negotiations was could be reasonably useful, because that's what they were doing during all those previous 17 years, by just repeating their approval of the existing nuclear weapons treaties, nuclear arms control treaties, and various nuclear initiatives. With respect to real, I don't have time to elaborate on that, but with respect to real involvement or engagement of China, Britain, and France into strategic nuclear arms control, I think that the P5 format is not effective. It cannot be used for that matter, because France and Britain are not interested in Chinese limitations, just like China is not interested in French and British limitations. You can only have fruitful arms limitation agreement or negotiations if you have a reason for a ground for some trade-offs. I limit or reduce my forces in exchange of yours limiting or reducing your forces. And that implies mutual deterrence relationship. So my proposal to the United States with respect to China is to stop calling on China to join arms control negotiations. That will lead nowhere. You should do something more effective and more profound. You should propose to China an option of arms control between China and the United States that would not legalize Chinese inferiority, and that would improve Chinese security situation compared to the absence of such agreement. This is a very difficult task, but that was done many years ago in Glassboro, when Secretary McNamara and President Johnson met with Premier Kosygin of the Soviet Union and proposed to Kosygin to start negotiations on limiting ballistic missile defenses. And that was something that responded to those two important conditions. And after initially rejecting it, in a year, the Soviet Union said, yes, we are willing to do that, because in Moscow, they made assessment and understood that such negotiations would not legalize Soviet inferiority in strategic arms and would make Soviet strategic position much better than otherwise. So you should think something of that kind with respect to US-Chinese strategic relationship. The same goes for Russia, of course. You know that President Putin said that British and French nuclear weapons have to be also limited. Well, it's up to Moscow to think of the possible treaty that would be attractive to France and Britain, who have mutual deterrence relationship with Russia, that would not legalize the inferiority in the weapons that would be subject to agreement, and that would improve their security situation compared to the absence of such agreement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexey. You covered a lot of ground, very thoughtful ideas. I would just note before we turn to Tonie, Jáquez, that as we were listening to you, Rose Guttmuller sent me a copy of her latest article in Foreign Affairs titled "Arms Control is Not Dead," suggesting something similar to what you just described, Alexey, which is the United States should pursue parallel but separate talks with Russia and with China on risk reduction and arms control. So thank you. Tonie, if you could join us on camera, please. As I said earlier, Tonie Jáquez is coordinator for disarmament and nonproliferation at the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and is a veteran of multilateral meetings and more. We're very happy to have you with us to provide a perspective from a non-nuclear weapon state that's been concerned about the status of progress on disarmament. Tonie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Daryl, and the Arms Control Association for inviting me and for giving me this opportunity to share some views on this very important issue. I just want to state that although I am the coordinator for disarmament at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Mexico, this is not an official statement. These are my views, but also reflect some of the views expressed by non-nuclear weapon states, in the meetings, especially in the NPT context. And in that regard, I hope that they offered some counterpoint to what the effect of these issues have in the room, the impact of these issues in the room. So first, what I want to comment is that stating the obvious, this is the last treaty between the United States and Russia that in arms control that remains in force or remains alive. This is important to mention, although everybody knows that the treaty will expire. But I wanted to start by saying this because we don't come to analyze this issue from a point of nowhere or in a vacuum. We are suffering the effects of a continuous erosion of the architecture of the arms control treaties that we had in the past, and this is important. There is a combination of a lot of crises colliding with each other that are of concern for most of the non-nuclear weapon states. For example, we have the erosion of the treaties. We have the already widespread frustration and concern over the lack of progress on disarmament, or at least the pace of disarmament that was expected is not there. But now we have nuclear risks and on unprecedented levels, and we have the re-emergence of the banalization of the threat of use of nuclear weapons present as never before. We have also a lot of questioning over commitments and obligations that were acquired by states under the NPT and other other mechanisms. There is the perception that the inequalities of the NPT driven non-nuclear weapon states to continue demanding the nuclear weapon states to fulfill their disarmament obligations and their commitments as agreed in 1995, in 2000 and 2010. So this is making a lot of noise amongst the non-nuclear weapon states. A lot of them call this disappointment or disillusionment or frustration. But it is really a concern about the validity of international law. Because if you question agreements and understandings and agreements and obligations under international law, then the very, very fine line between the law of the jungle and civilization starts to blur. And in this sense, I wanted to remind ourselves that for the non-nuclear weapon states, the START Treaty belongs to this set of commitments and obligations acquired by, yes, the Russian Federation and the United States, because they are the parties to this treaty, but they are also part of agreements that have been taken under the NPT. This is a direct, the treaty, I mean, it's a direct inheritance from the 13 steps to give content to fulfillment of the disarmament obligations of Article 6 of the NPT. It is a concrete direct effect of or inheritance from the 7th of that of those 13 steps of that agreement that refer to the early entry into force and full implementation of the START 2 and the conclusion of START 3 treaties as soon as possible. This was agreed in the year 2000. And I wanted to remind ourselves of this because the reason or the rationale to include these treaties as part of the 13 steps is very important and is relevant now to give content to not only to the fulfillment of Article 6, but also to understand why it is important to keep calling for an extension, renewal, or a new negotiation on the currency and the life of the New START Treaty. In the 7th of the 13 steps, it was very explicitly said that this was a cornerstone of strategic stability and the basis for further reductions of weapons. And in that regard, not extending the New START Treaty or having some doubts about the validity of the action itself or of reducing or further or looking for further reductions. It's direct contradiction with the previous obligations and commitments acquired by the nuclear weapon states under the NPT. The New START Treaty says that there is a commitment and this is a way to fulfill the obligations under Article 6 of the nuclear weapon states and to the achievement of the historic goal of freeing humanity from the nuclear threat. So this is not something that the non-nuclear weapon states have brought up. This is also embedded in the treaty. So as long as this treaty exists, there is some kind of anchor between these arms control agreements and diplomatic dialogue towards arms control amongst the nuclear weapon states and the obligations in Article 6. If we lose that, that is going to be a major blow to the sense of validity of previous agreements and obligations under the NPT. And this is something that goes against the national interest of all the non-nuclear weapon states, of course, but also of the nuclear weapon states themselves. We need to remind ourselves that the Nonproliferation Treaty has served also as a risk reduction measure in itself. It has provided for a platform and a mechanism of dialogue that has reduced the risk and the security concerns for the nuclear weapon states. If we continue minimizing the importance of this platform and the treaty itself, then it's going to be very difficult to restore trust and restore confidence in the regime, the non-proliferation and disarmament and peaceful uses of nuclear energy regime. I don't think that this is a very wise movement at this time. I don't think that that is in the interest of the nuclear weapon states, but certainly it's not in the interest of the non-nuclear weapon states. I wanted to give a final comment because sometimes we hear that there are some misconceptions about what constitutes a bilateral agreement, what constitutes interference in other countries' affairs. And sometimes countries from the non-nuclear weapon state side refrain themselves to give opinions about some of the bilateral treaties that are signed among the nuclear weapon states because it feels like interference. In the case of the New START Treaty, because as I said, this is anchored in previous agreements and obligations, it has to be seen as a fulfillment of the whole package of agreements that we have forged in the past to give content to the fulfillment not only of Article 6 but of the whole grand bargain that gave way to the NPT. So this is major. The effects on international stability that the reductions of strategic weapons gave in the past should be seen as a confidence-building measure that is needed right now. I agree with the proposals of my previous fellow speakers. I think that the politics or international politics, but mainly multilateral politics, is based on signals. And the signaling that we need to receive from the point of view of the non-nuclear weapon states, from the nuclear weapon states, is that the regime is in place and that the agreements and obligations that we have acquired under this regime are still current and valid. And of course, there has to be some adjustment. As I said before, this treaty, for example, the New START, is an inheritance from previous treaties that were expressed or explicitly mentioned in previous agreements. We cannot function as taking for granted that the previous agreements are still in place, but we need to adapt. But if we have this sense of background and this background as the foundation of agreements and obligations, we keep giving content to the previous understandings that we have had under the NPT. If we receive the signal that these agreements are not in place, or that these agreements are not current anymore, or that these are valid just for the non-nuclear weapon states, but not for the nuclear weapon states, and that we have to keep cultivating double standards in international law and in multilateral affairs, this is not a confidence-building measure. It's the opposite. It's a mistrust-building measure. And I don't think that that is the way that we need to go this time. We need to preserve the regime that has been very useful, very successful with all its shortcomings. But at the same time, we need to understand that at this time and age, what we need to preserve is the validity of international law and the norms that we have agreed to. So non-nuclear weapon states are going to continue fighting for this notion that all the measures and all the provisions of this treaty, that is one of the most universal treaties that exist in multilateral affairs, need to be fulfilled by all the parties at all times, not as a voluntary or as a picking and choosing exercise of which obligations can be fulfilled or not. The risks of not doing this is very complicated. I don't have a crystal ball, and I don't want to sound very fatalistic, but I see an incentive for non-proliferation, for proliferation, an incentive for breaking some of the agreements and obligations, also from the point of view of the non-nuclear weapon states. So I am going to finish with this thought, and I'm very, very happy to answer any questions that are posed to me. Thank you, Derek.
Thank you so much, Tonie. This is a global problem. It's important to have a global perspective on this. Let me ask Alexey and Tom to go back on camera to rejoin us for the Q&A, and because Alexey Arbatov has to be departing from the webinar in about 15 minutes, I wanted to start out with a question for Alexey, and maybe Tom, you can also quickly address this. But as you both know, and others are aware, I mean, for years the United States and Russia have not just discussed strategic offensive nuclear weapons, but strategic defensive weapons, as well as intermediate range nuclear forces and sub-strategic, or also called tactical nuclear weapons. And so the question, Alexey, is since Donald Trump took office for a second time, he has announced a plan, as yet, of course, unrealized, unspecified, to further expand the United States strategic defense architecture, which has been a source of tension, of course, between the US and the Soviet Union, the US and Russia for years. And this is also known here in the US by the Trump administration as the Golden Dome Plan, and includes ideas for space-based interceptors. How, Alexey, is that being perceived in Russia? How might that affect near-term talks on preserving, as you say, what we currently have, the limits established by New START, or not?
It was perceived in Russia without a great panic, because we have experience of the 1980s when President Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative really produced a shock in the Soviet Union, and a lot of terrible things were expected, but it never come to anything serious. So now it is accepted in a much more calm way than before. And certainly, if we are talking about at least 5-year extension of the New START, it will have no relevance to Golden Dome, because it would take much longer time to do anything with respect to space systems. In principle, of course, this is Russian concern, and always was Russian concern. Under the START 1 negotiations, it was the principal apple of discord. And since I was lucky to participate in negotiations, I remember how much struggle was dedicated to resolving this issue of space arms. And all this time was just wasted. We could have much better agreement on offensive weapons if we didn't waste so much on something that proved to be an empty dream or empty promise. For the future, certainly, if we are lucky to preserve some kind of limitations in line with the New START, if we are even more lucky to go forward with new reductions or new limitations, then sometime this issue of ballistic missile defense would come back and will have to be taken account. Russia insists on its traditional position that the interaction between strategic offensive arms reduction and strategic defensive arms limitations has to be preserved. It's one of the 3 sacred principles of strategic stability, and it will remain part of Russian position. But it's not a relevant problem within the next few years, when we have to address much more urgent things: New START, CTBT, and NPT.
All right, thank you very much. We have another question from the audience. I want to ask Tom and Alexey to address. As we're all familiar, a couple of years ago, Russia suspended implementation of New START. The United States has noted in its annual compliance assessment report that as a result of the treaty being suspended and the on-site inspections being suspended, information exchanges, the United States has less of an ability to verify Russian compliance with the limits. Is there any opportunity in the near term? Is there any purpose, given that the treaty is going to expire soon, to try to address the mutual compliance concerns that each side has? Or should we look forward to new arrangement. So just quickly, Alexey and then Tom on that subject, please.
It depends on general political relations between Trump administration and Putin administration. If they move forward with respect to their general political relations, in particular, moving forward towards peaceful settlement of Ukrainian crisis, and Russia expects from the United States to stop providing weapons and stop providing intelligence information to Ukraine and be more forceful on applying pressure on Ukraine to come to an agreement, then we could just revive the New START for the time that is left for it, and maybe even extend it for the next 5 years, according to my proposal, introducing amendment to Article 14 and using the phrasing of the my beloved START 1 treaty.
Tom?
Thanks. Let me first say I very much welcome Alexey's comments about ballistic missile defense, both because I agree that there is an inextricable linkage between offensive weapons and defensive mechanisms that has to be addressed in any nuclear treaty. But also I'm glad to hear that Moscow views the Golden Dome proposal more calmly than it viewed Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative 40 years ago. I think that's a realistic view because the fact is that the Golden Dome will never work. The expansion by the Trump administration of a limited proposal to defend against certain limited threats and to try to turn it into an impenetrable shield to protect all of America against all missile threats is utterly unrealistic and can be overwhelmed by the much cheaper option on the part of China or Russia or anyone else of simply building a lot more missiles. So I agree that there is not a need to address the US Golden Dome proposal in the immediate set of arms control negotiations. And I would hope that neither Beijing nor Moscow would interpose it as a precondition to having meaningful discussions and meaningful new agreements. I also agree that if there were a desire on the part of the United States to resume on-site inspections under the terms of the New START agreement, that this could be discussed with Russia. I do not, however, think that it should be insisted upon if that leads to complications in a very simple agreement, as I outlined, to continue to abide by the New START central limits. On-site verification is important for building confidence, but that can be the next step, and it can come in line with any discussions about new agreements that would follow the simple handshake that I outlined.
All right, thanks. So we have just a couple more minutes with Alexey. So let me just ask one more question that if he could address, and also Tom, which is, we've heard Donald Trump talk about his interest in talks with Russia and with China. We've heard the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs respond by saying essentially we're ready to have this negotiation. Who is it on the Russian side who would be leading these negotiations? Is it Russia's expectation that there needs to be an opposite number at the same rank? And is Russia really prepared for such a negotiation? And same question then to Tom, is the Trump administration properly staffed, ready? Who would it be, given that this is still early days in the new administration? Or is this another Steve Witkoff operation trying to negotiate by himself with his opposite number? So Alexey, your quick thoughts on this, please.
Well, I think that Russian position would be that this so-called handshake agreement could be negotiated in informal way, just by appointed representatives and then approved by the presidents. But if we are to negotiate something more serious and more formal, we certainly need formal negotiations, formal diplomats and the military and others to go to Geneva to sit there and negotiate a new treaty. Even 5-year extension and amendment to the New START treaty has to be dealt with in professional and very, very thorough way. Who personally, I do not know. We have a number of diplomats who have many years experience still sitting in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So we'll have plenty of candidates to run such negotiations.
All right, thanks. Tom, your thoughts?
Well, I agree again with Alexey that a simple handshake agreement does not require a full team of negotiators, and that can be done fairly quickly, I would hope. But beyond that, it's difficult to say who on the US side would lead a long, complex negotiation, whether it's an amendment to New START or a new treaty. Certainly, Steve Witkoff has more than enough on his plate right now with Russia, Ukraine, Iran, and I don't even know what else. It is necessary for the White House to rely upon the professional experience and judgment that is embedded in the ranks of the State Department, who have served loyally and negotiated well under both Republican and Democratic presidents in the past. That team is depleted today, but there has to be an element of trust that the White House puts in the State Department and other agency professionals to do a negotiation. And here I'll be a little bit negative. I did not list all the reasons, all the obstacles that there may be to achieving even a simple handshake deal. But one of them is the evident distrust that the White House has towards the entire State Department, as well as other government agencies. That does not bode well for a successful negotiation. The other thing that concerns me is that there is still strong support in the Congress, not just for expanded ballistic missile defense, but also for an expanded US nuclear arsenal and spending more money on nuclear weapons. Whenever President Trump puts out an idea, in most cases, there's a long line of Republican senators who go to the microphone and say what a good idea it is. So far, I haven't seen any of the Republicans stand up and say, we agree with President Trump on the need to reduce spending and arsenals. And that concerns me and makes me very cautious about success in the ideas we've been discussing. Thanks.
I may have one final remark. Please advise President Trump not to use the term denuclearization when he is talking about US-Russian dialogue, because denuclearization was applied to Korean Peninsula, and it was a failure. It was never successful. So he probably remembers his visit to North Korea. That's why he uses this term. But in Russia, it has a bad connotation.
Well, we'll have to rely on you and our other Russian colleagues to encourage President Putin to encourage President Trump not to use that word. So you probably have a better chance of getting that in there than we do. But with that, let me just thank Alexey Arbatov for joining us. He has to depart today's webinar, but we will continue. Alexey, thank you so much. Очень спасибо, and do take care, and until next time. Thanks.
Thank you, Daryl, and thank you, Tom and Tonie and all those who are present at this very interesting meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me ask Tony Jáquez to join in to address this issue of who should be involved and who should be consulted regarding what happens after New START expires. So Tony, your thoughts.
Well, hopefully, before New START expires, there is some signaling that there is some diplomatic dialogue. I wanted to say that one of the most important features of the previous, or at least the last two cycles of the review conferences of the NPT, the previous one and this one, is the absence of diplomatic dialogue or apparent diplomatic dialogue amongst the five. I know that the nuclear weapon states have been meeting at expert level, but the content of the press releases or the communiques is shorter and shorter, poorer and poorer. We know that the environment has some influence in this, but I just wanted to say that the mere indication that there has been some diplomatic dialogue amongst the United States and Russia, that would be a shift. There would be a major shift in the context of the NPT. So now there is this question address that I would like to address, which is how to make the other nuclear weapon states participate in these talks. And I want to say that we need to be very serene about the fact that the non-nuclear weapon states and the other nuclear weapon states, excepting the major possessors, have to also respect the frameworks of arms control between the United States and Russia as a strategic stability between the two of them. And that doesn't mean that these are just bilateral treaties, as I said, because they are founded by the same framework of the NPT regime. But they are not for everybody to participate, because they need to come to some agreements on reductions so that they could reestablish trust amongst themselves. That doesn't have to do with the fact that all nuclear weapon states and also all the parties of the NPT are committed under Article 6 to negotiations on nuclear disarmament, and that is the key issue. This is just one of the stepping stones, some would say, towards broader agreements in which all the parties of the NPT should participate. The very risky issue now is that some of the other other nuclear weapon states, but also non-nuclear weapon states now are talking about attitudes and behaviors that might be against the regime or against the provisions of the NPT, like extending possession of nuclear weapons to non-nuclear weapon states, or extended the deterrence to other countries outside of the framework of the NPT, and that is very risky, because now we have to protect not only let me rephrase it, non-nuclear weapon states now have to demand the fulfillment of the non-proliferation provisions of the treaty, not only the disarmament provisions of the treaty. And that is a new thing that has emerged this year with the talks about new countries having nuclear weapons in some other area. So what I wanted to say is that the bilateral agreements between the major possessors have to run their course so that they serve as a confidence building measure and as a risk reduction measure. But then the other nuclear weapon states and all the NPT parties have the obligation to participate in negotiations at a later stage. And that is not my opinion, was also the opinion of the ICJ in the advisory opinion of 1996. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let me turn to Tom with return to a question that you and Alexey talked about. Tony, you started addressing this, but in our questions coming from the audience, I mean, one of the questions people keep coming back to is how can, as the United States and Russia, begin to look at and resolve their own bilateral nuclear relationship in the wake of New START, how can the other NPT nuclear armed states be involved in the disarmament process? Tom, you just returned from a trip to Asia, discussing with other experts on the sidelines of the latest P5 governmental meeting. And what kind of framework might work given the limitations of the P5 process, given that China does not want to engage in a trilateral negotiation with the US, given that France and the UK are concerned right now about fortifying their own nuclear deterrent capability vis-a-vis Russia. I mean, what are some reasonable approaches that can help engage China, UK, and France in the disarmament process that the NPT Article 6 calls for them to engage in?
Okay, let me answer that on a few different levels. First, the so-called P5 process that's now been operating for 15 years is not a negotiation process. It's not intended to write a new treaty among the five. It is intended to build mutual understanding of each other's positions and do some of the groundwork that is necessary not only for progress among the US, China, and Russia, but also among the five overall. And the process is not dead, but it is languishing. And I strongly believe that it can do more to build some of that understanding and lay the groundwork for future progress. I wrote about this in last month's journal, Arms Control Today. That's one level. The second level, at a higher level, is the fact, as both you and Tonie have referenced, that none of the five nuclear weapons states are meeting their obligation under Article 6 of the Nonproliferation Treaty. They each have a different reason why somebody else has to do the work. We're trying, but it's up to someone else. And that's simply unacceptable, damages the credibility of all five. So what could the other three, China, France, and the UK, realistically do in order to demonstrate that they are committed to their obligation and provide some positive incentive that would help both the arms control process and deter the kind of proliferation concerns that Tonie just mentioned? There's a couple things they could do, whether it is China by itself, and I think China is in the best position to show some creative thinking, because I don't see enough creative thinking coming from Washington or Moscow right now. China could, for example, say that we should have a consultation, not a negotiation. I know that journalists constantly mix up those two words, and so do politicians, but a discussion, a consultation, is different than a negotiation. China is not about to have a three-way or five-way negotiation, but it could suggest that we have consultations at which the other three, France, Britain, and China, describe the conditions under which a five-way negotiation could become possible. That is, what else the US and Russia have to do before the other three join in, and put it on paper and have an agreement and commit to readiness for that five-way negotiation when Russia and the US do more. That would be a significant step by the other three countries. You can think of other more imaginative ones. One that I like, that the Arms Control Association wrote a report on a few months ago, is the idea of a nuclear summit where the five leaders would meet, and topic one at the summit would be nuclear weapons. That's not the place to negotiate a treaty, but it is a place to reaffirm in a very public way the five leaders' commitments not only to avoiding nuclear war, but a commitment to seek a world without nuclear weapons. These are ways in which Paris, London, and Beijing could begin visibly to meet their real obligations under the Nonproliferation Treaty.
All right, thank you, Tom. That report on nuclear disarmament summits, authored by Kelsey Davenport, is on the Arms Control Association website for those of you who want to take another look at that. Let me just come back to you, Tony, and I just want to press you a little bit more. You were describing how, the Mexican delegation, other non-nuclear weapon states are going to be listening for what the nuclear armed states say they are doing or not doing. And you noted that there's been an absence of information in the last two preparatory committee meetings. I mean, what specifically could the US delegation or the Russian delegation or all five do that would be helpful and productive at this upcoming Non-Proliferation Treaty preparatory committee meeting that will begin at the end of this month in New York, ahead of the review conference next year?
Thank you very for the question. One thing in all truth has already been done by the US delegation in the previous preparatory committee, which is to address, not deny or not question the previous agreements and obligations taken under the treaty, and one by one say some things that they have done in their statements. These declaratory value actions have some impact because they motivate some a type of interactivity in the room, which is something that is very much needed in order to foster dialogue and foster consensus in the NPT context. So I recognize that the United States has already done this in their statements. The other thing that has to be recognized is that the United States and the UK have put forward the reports and also have made provisions for side events to comment on the reports of compliance with the NPT. This gives the opportunity to delegations, also civil society and academia, and also the scholars, to question or to also ask legitimate questions about the reports and about what is being done and request more information. The whole spectrum of non-nuclear weapon states has a lot of nuances regarding this, because not all the delegations can participate, for example, in side events because of the size of their delegations. This is just a very pedestrian comment, but it is a fact. Sometimes delegations cannot participate in side events because of this. And that's why we have been requesting and pushing since the review conference in 2022 to have this discussion in the room as part of the formal proceedings, and also as a way for the nuclear weapon states to demonstrate accountability before the NPT parties, because not because they are not doing anything, but they need to demonstrate that even if they have some reasons, as Tom said about why they are not fulfilling fully their obligations under Article 6, then they owe that to the regime to explain why and to give some sense of transparency and accountability that non-nuclear weapon states already have, because of the safeguards agreements and the surveillance and verification that we are subject under the treaty by the IAEA standards, and that does not mirror exactly what the nuclear weapon states have under the treaty. So this could be done, and this has to be done. And I am very confident that this is going to be, that this plea for more transparency and accountability, which is not a solution to the whole a range of problems under the NPT, but it is just a seminal activity that might restore confidence in the room, can be done. if some of the nuclear weapon states are willing to answer questions from the room, and also the non-nuclear weapon states come prepared to ask questions over the statements of declarations and also the reports. Unfortunately, I don't see a lot of progress in the possibility of having a separated slot of time to do this as part of the proceedings of the NPT preparatory committee, maybe the REDCON, if we are very lucky. But this is part of what the diplomats should be doing, listening, not only to reply, but to understand each other and try to foster consensus from the beginning of the discussions, not at the end when we have a document already circulated that we have to put our authorities on their toes to approve. And that raises very quickly the political cost of accepting or not accepting. You know? So this is not the essence of diplomatic work. And when I said before about the lack of diplomatic dialogue is that we don't have a lot of instances to do that with the nuclear weapon states, but also amongst all the parties of the NPT. We have been lacking that in previous years. And it is not also, it's not a problem of the NPT only, that's also the situation across the world in the United Nations. So we need to recover a little bit of the practice of talking to each other and questioning each other, having more interactivity, and the nuclear weapon states have a golden opportunity if they want to do that. But if the problem is, and I don't want to say that I am concerned about this, but sometimes they have come with the attitude of questioning the previous agreements and obligations, saying that they are not current anymore now, and in one way or the other, and then implying that they are only valid and very much in force for the non-nuclear weapon states. And that attitude has created a lot of tension in the past review conferences, to say the least. So this is what we need to avoid.
So on the subject of the NPT dynamics, I would just note that in the current issue of Arms Control today, we have an interview with the three most recent chairs of the preparatory committee meetings. That's quite interesting. That explores some of these challenges and some of their ideas about solutions. We're running up to time, but we've got time for a question from the audience before we begin to wrap up. And we have a question, Tom, from one of our European colleagues about how the United States, European allies will view negotiations with Russia on nuclear matters. I mean, you've already addressed to some extent how a agreement in some form between the U.S. and Russia to restrain or to maintain the caps on their strategic arsenals would benefit China. We've heard from Tonie, the strong interest from non-nuclear weapon states in, at the very least, maintaining these limits and respecting Article 6 obligations. How would you say, Tom, this would be in the interest, security interest of European allies, and how can the U.S. in particular assuage concerns that European countries might have about how this might undermine their security or the position of Ukraine vis-a-vis the war by Russia against Ukraine?
Well, the first point I would make is that I think it is important that Europeans are defining for themselves their security interests. It has long been the European habit to rely upon the United States as a partner in the defense of Europe against any kind of threat. Now, Europe has been doing this for a number of years. The joining of NATO by Finland and Sweden was a direct result of the Russian war in Ukraine. And now the discussion about the potential European nuclear deterrent to be supplied by the UK and France is a direct result not only of the continued aggression in Ukraine, but of real doubts about the reliability of the United States as a security partner for Europe. Now, how might that play out in arms control terms? There's a couple of ways that I think are not helpful. One, for example, is if the US and Russia were to negotiate an agreement that says Russia will pull back the weapons it has deployed to Belarus if the US removes weapons it has deployed at NATO bases. There are circumstances under which that might be a good deal, but it would not be politically reassuring to Europe, and I think would simply further fuel the interest in Europe providing more defense spending and thinking more seriously about its own nuclear deterrent. Similarly, from the Russian side, there's a question in the Q&A that asks, how could Russia agree to limits at a time when Europe seems to be building its own nuclear deterrent? Well, the answer I would give is this. Russia has never liked the fact that the US provided some form of nuclear umbrella to Europe. It also will not like if France and the UK now provide such an umbrella. In fact, the only thing Russia would really like is if Russia were the only country in Europe that had a nuclear umbrella. That would be the ideal, but it is not realistic. And what I fear is kind of a parallel hesitation in Washington and Moscow. In Washington, as China builds up, there are already the arguments that say we can't build down, and in fact, we have to build up to match Russia and China together. And I think in Russia, there will be this incentive to say we can't build down. In fact, we have to build up if the UK and France are now providing security for the rest of Europe. This kind of hesitation or argument for getting into more of an arms race, I think will defeat not just arms control goals, but will make all of Europe less secure. Thanks.
All right. So we've got about 7 minutes before we run out of time. This is the lightning round of questions. So I've got a question for each of you. I want you to be brief, please, before I address another question that's come in. A couple of folks have asked about how China's proposal for talks on a no first use agreement are being perceived, both in Washington and in the non-nuclear weapon state world. So Tonie, is that productive? Is that realistic? Is that does that address Mexico's concerns, other countries' concerns about China's responsibilities under Article 6? And Tom, how could and should the United States, respond to that overture from China? So as briefly as you can, please.
Yes. For most of the non-nuclear weapon states, especially the ones, the like-minded countries, like the New Agenda Coalition, the ideal thing would be the no-use policy of nuclear weapons. But a no first use statement is seen as a confidence-building mechanism and as a risk reduction measure. It's not a substitute for other obligations and commitments. So this is appreciated by the non-nuclear weapon states in general. And in fact, I mentioned the New Agenda Coalition that last year had its 25th birthday. It's 15th birthday, I'm sorry. No, 25th, I'm sorry. In the original New Agenda statement, the ministerial statement, what the New Agenda was about was a request. There was a request for all the nuclear weapon states to issue no first use statements as a building measure. This should not be identified as a as a permission or as a justification to be the second to strike or the third to strike or the fourth to strike. In that sense, it would be a confidence building measure, nothing else, or not a further political value, but a very important confidence building measure.
Tom, your thoughts quickly?
It's a serious idea from the Chinese for all 5 to commit to no first use. Unfortunately, both in track 1 and in track 2 discussions, you don't get much more from the Chinese than read our paper. It's all in there. This is exactly what the P5 discussion process should be covering. Not negotiating a treaty, but discussing an idea like this, and I hope the Chinese will be open to discussing it. Other related topics that they should be discussing are the negotiation of a legally binding negative security assistance treaty. That's something the P5 could take the lead on.
All right, and we have a question which I'm going to answer because time is short, about the role of Congress in a process for U.S.-Russian nuclear arms control talks. Congress does have a role. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee can and should be asking and getting answers to questions about what President Trump has said about his interest in such talks, how the State Department and the NSC are pursuing this. I would also note that there was a letter sent in February, I believe it was February 19th, by over 20 all Democratic senators and House members to Secretary Rubio, expressing support for talks between the U.S. and Russia ahead of the New START expiration. To date, there has not been a reply or response to that letter, which did ask for information from the administration about its thinking and strategy. I would also note that there is concurrent legislation that's been introduced in the House and the Senate, HRES 100 and SRES 61, which condemn any form of nuclear threats and encourage the president to pursue talks with Russia bilaterally and China bilaterally on nuclear risk reduction and arms control, and urges the United States and Russia to refrain from increasing their strategic stockpiles as talks on a more durable comprehensive agreement continue. So Congress has a role. In my view, it's only being partially exercised, and it's important for Americans to contact our elected leaders to encourage them to do their job. So we're at time. I want to thank both Tom and Tonie for their excellent expert contributions. To summarize some of the key points here, time is short before New START expires. The stakes are high. A comprehensive, detailed treaty negotiation between the U.S. and Russia would be difficult in good times, even more difficult in these times. And as Tom and I think Alexey Arbatov suggested, the U.S. and Russian presidents could pursue an interim approach to maintain the New START warhead and delivery system caps while they pursue more comprehensive talks on a more formal nuclear arms control, arms reduction agreement. And we shall see whether these talks begin sooner or later. And we will, at the Arms Control Association, stay on top of this. We'll look forward to engaging with many of you online and beyond. But it's clear from our perspective that more nuclear weapons make us all less secure, and that it remains important for the United States and Russia to resume their talks to pursue a safer path through disarmament diplomacy. So thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for your attention. And as I said before, this webinar will be archived on the Arms Control Association website in the coming days. So thank you, Tonie. Thank you, Tom. We're adjourned. Bye-bye.